Welcome to this episode of If I Knew Then What I Know Now, a podcast where two longtime friends, almost 20 years strong, come together to have real, honest conversations about life, growth, and the lessons we wish we had learned sooner.
With different backgrounds, male and female, black and white, we bring unique perspectives shaped by our experiences, struggles, and our personal journeys.
Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most misunderstood parts of relationships: boundaries, especially in family. In this follow-up episode, we explore the complexities of setting boundaries with parents and often overlook reality that kids have their own boundaries as well.
Through personal stories and honest reflection, we talk about moments when boundaries were missed, moments when they were respected, and why learning to navigate them to strengthen relationships rather than weaken them.
So if you've ever struggled with guilt, obligation, or confusion around family boundaries, this conversation is for you.
Sit back, tune in, and get to know your hosts, Dwight and Jo.
Understanding and setting boundaries.
Last time we talked a lot about how important boundaries are in relationships, but today we want to go and dig a little deeper.
Every episode she brings that shovel. I had a moment with my 5-year-old grandson where I realized I completely got it wrong as it relates to boundaries.
The truth is, a lot of us were never taught how to set healthy boundaries, especially in our families.
And sometimes the hardest thing is not really setting boundaries. It's realizing when someone else, especially a child, is trying to set a boundary with you, the adult.
Today, we're here talking about both boundaries with parents and respecting boundaries with kids.
So we're going to share a couple of stories with you today. A couple of those stories is where we completely got it wrong, and a couple where, we got it right, and what we learned from both of those.
So, Dwight, boundaries with parents can be complicated at any age.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I don't know that I've ever set a boundary with my parents. I couldn't even recall that. But what I learned and recognized is that respecting boundaries with kids can be a really humbling experience. And that's because, as adults, parents, grandparents, we sometimes assume that we know the best, that we have all the answers. But a lot of times we don't get it right, especially as it relates to kids and boundaries.
Yeah, boundaries often get misunderstood. I mean, people think that they're mean or we're shutting someone out, but we're not. We're not being disrespectful. Boundaries are just about clarity, respect, and getting your own needs met.
Right. Exactly. And as we talked about in the last episode, a healthy boundary basically says, what, this is what I need from you, at that particular time, this is what I need. And being able to communicate that need and have that need respected is really important.
Yep. And when boundaries aren't recognized, it can create resentment, confusion, and sometimes distance in a relationship. I also want to connect this back to our last couple of episodes where we talked about some deep discussions about fear, the belief that we're not enough. Those things make you shrink, but boundaries actually bring you back, and it's a lot more complicated when emotions are involved. In relationships, right?
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that's really important that I don't want us to miss, right, is that applies both ways, right? Boundaries that we have, expectations for kids, and then, the boundaries that kids have where they have expectations. So it goes both ways. But, as we talked about, sometimes, we as the adults think it's that one way thing. And, it's really important. And like I said, a lot of times humbling when you step back and just say, hey, this little person has some boundaries that they want to express, and we need to be willing to be open to listening to that, recognizing that, and giving them that space or whatever it is that they're asking for.
So next, we're going to get into some stories where we're actually going to talk about boundaries that we put into place, and then we're also going to talk about some boundaries that children in our lives have put in place.
Well, yeah, I'm really excited to have that conversation because, as I say, I had one situation that was extremely humbling, and I learned a lot from that.
Yep. And I had an aha moment myself as well. So
Yeah,
looking forward to getting into that.
do it.
So, Dwight, tell me a story, your story about where you got it wrong.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This one, like I said, is very humbling. So, my youngest grandson, he was 4 at the time. He's 5 now. Um, and this situation really made me reflect on, boundaries, especially with kids. So, let me give you a little bit of context, right? Let's say he's 5 now. He was 4 at the time. And I will honestly say that I believe that this kid is like one of the most emotionally intelligent people that I know,
Yeah.
not just a kid, just extremely intelligent. And I actually have learned so much from him. And in this particular situation, I totally missed it, right? My whole thing in the morning with him is, getting through the routine, trying to get from point A to point B. And I absolutely miss what he was trying to communicate. And it wasn't until I had some time to reflect on that situation that I actually realized and processed like this is what he was doing. He was setting that boundary. So, instead of me acknowledging it, I actually interpreted his request for a boundary as being disrespectful. And that just kind of took me back again, thinking about, as a child, I didn't get to, have any say in what mom or dad or adults said, because that would have been disrespectful. So in this situation, I felt like, wow, this little guy is being disrespectful. And I missed it so badly that I interpreted it so wrong that I ended up actually, disciplining him because my thing was, hey, he's being disrespectful. And when I really reflected on it, I found out and realized it wasn't being disrespectful. He was just asking for a boundary. And me, growing up granddad, who, again, wants to be loving, wants to, have discipline and all those things that require, I missed that. So tough lesson for me. But um, I think growth is about looking for opportunities to be better. And this is one where I actually felt like I did. So let me tell you what happened.
Okay.
So
I was getting ready to say, what did he
yeah,
say to you?
yeah. So we were prepping one morning, trying to get the day started. And usually he'll wake up, and I'll allow him to watch TV while I'm, kind of doing my daily things, shaving, doing all that stuff. And then I kind of, pull him in to get him, to, brush his teeth, do all those kind of things. Well, this particular morning, right? As I'm trying to do this, trying to transition to that, he was just being really slow, not turning off the TV, not wanting to get out of bed and, come and do those kind of things. And I'm like, yeah, yeah. So I'm like, hey, come on, we really need to, get your teeth brushed so we can make breakfast and do all these things. And this 4-year-old kid looked at me and he said, Granddad, I don't need you to act like my dad or to be my dad. I need you to be my friend.
Wow.
Well, first of all, that coming from a 4-year-old floored me, right?
Right.
Absolutely, because how do you as 4-year old come up with that, right? So floored me. And then of course I went into, oh my God, you don't say that to me. That's disrespectful. We need to do this. And it wasn't until later that evening, I had totally forgotten about this when I called to talk to his mom and his grandma, that they were saying we were FaceTime and they were saying like, hey, he said that you hurt him. So that floored me, right? Because a situation where he was asking for a boundary, he interpreted my reaction as hurting him.
Mhm.
Totally floored me, right? So when I reflected on that, that was something that I was like, wow, that obviously was not my intent.
Right.
But when I explained to them what happened, they understood. But what I took from that was he's asking for a boundary that I interpret as disrespect. And as a result, what he takes away from was being hurt because I popped his hand.
Mhm.
So that was a real humbling experience for
Yeah.
me. Again, to go back and realize what he was asking for. What he was asking for at that particular time was for me, again, to be that friend and lighthearted and fun because he's that kind of kid. He loves that, right? So that was tough for me to be able to, step back and realize, well, he wasn't being disrespectful. He was asking for a boundary. As we define boundaries, he was telling me exactly what he needed from me, and I missed that.
And earlier you said that, as a kid ourselves, right? We didn't have that same voice. We didn't talk to our parents the right way. And so I'm sure that in that moment you were like, wow, like, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So, and I also remember when you were telling me about the story a couple weeks ago, you first told me about that. You said that that changed the way that you handled the transitions. That's what you call it, right? The transitions in the morning. So tell us what you do now.
absolutely right. And because what I didn't want him ever taken away from us, asking for a boundary was to be like, hey, well, if I ask for a boundary, then that's going to mean I'm disciplined or even hurt.
Mhm.
So now with that, those transitions in the morning, I know what he likes. He likes to laugh. So whenever he wakes up and we're getting ready to make that transition, I will go tickle him. His thing, I tickle him is, Mr. Claw. So I'm like laughing with him, engaging with him, I'm making it fun for him, right? Because that's what he likes. That's what he sees as friend. He loves music, right? So in the morning time, he has his favorite songs that I'll put on. He loves to do all these crazy little dances, and he asked me to record those to send them to his mom, and we do that. So I just reprogram my thinking of for him being fun, that being fun and those kind of things is what he wants. But we're also getting to or from point A to point B. But I just had to step back and say, how can I do that and meet his needs and, respect that boundary, to be that friend, but yet still provide that discipline and structure. So that's how we do that now. And it feels amazing just to be able to know that, I did recognize that and I did, make that change and flip that switch because that's what he needed.
That's awesome. And that is so healthy. Um, you know, healthy for him now. He's not going to grow up being fearful or insecure, because you recognized that he had a voice where we didn't have that growing up. So it changed things and influenced the way that we handle relationships. So A, that's healthy. B, it also tells him that his voice matters and that there's safety there. Yeah, so that's really really awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like I said, had it not been for that phone call that evening, it just might have slipped my mind and I probably would have not gotten it right again. But I had one where I was able to get it right and we'll talk about that.
Awesome. All right. So you told us about where you got something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you learned from that, right?
Oh, I did.
So then after that, the next situation, you're able to get it right.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, right? I feel like this little kid is one of the most like emotionally intelligent people that I know.
Mhm.
So rewind probably 3 weeks ago, right? We're hanging out and something similar happened. And I was so happy that I was able to figure this out, right? Because he'll just come out of the blue with these things that just floor me.
Yeah.
So he always, when he goes to the bathroom, he wants me near. But on this particular day, he's like, "Hey, granddad, I'm going to the bathroom. Come over here. Like, stand right here." So I'm kind of just hanging out right there. So I'm just, watching him get ready to use the bathroom. And he looks at me and he says, "Privacy, please." And I'm like, "Huh?" I'm like, where do you come up with that, right? I mean, those are his words, "Privacy, please." I'm like, "Well, you asked me to like come over here," but then he tells me like, "No, I want you to face that way," blah blah blah. And in that moment, right, almost I'm thinking like, "Hey, I got stuff to do," but I'm like, "Okay, I get it now." So I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I'm gonna just stand right here. Just let me know when you're done," that kind of thing. And now, as a result of that, right, we have this little thing. Every time he goes to the bathroom, I'm like, "Hey, I understand you want privacy, right?"
Yeah.
And it's a game now with us. So whenever I'm in the bathroom, if I'm shading or something, he comes in to ask something, I'll just be, "Oh, excuse me, I need privacy, please." And then he'll like hide behind the wall.
Yeah.
But in that moment, right, that was almost another one that, I had the opportunity to get wrong and got it right. And right off the bat, kind of make that fun interaction
Yeah.
that we now do every day. So um before I talked about, growth is you looking for opportunities to be better, right? And you gotta be on your toes, especially with kids, right? Right. So I made sure I didn't miss that moment, and he now understands, that if he wants privacy and he asks for privacy, I'm gonna give him that, and vice versa. If I'm wanting privacy or something, he respects that, and that feels so different than, not getting it right.
So yeah,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah. So with that, right, I watched this interesting podcast, and it was talking about relationships, family, and that type of thing. And it was a podcast that was actually being hosted by Michelle Obama and her brother.
Okay.
Really interesting. And, we'll link to that video in here. And in that podcast, right, they had Damon Wayans and his brother Marlon Wayans on, and they were again talking about the power of family, respect, and raising kids with love, right, which is really what we're talking about. And I remember Damon Wayans saying something that stuck with me. We always talk about like grandkids, how different it is raising them, right? I remember both my son and daughter with my grandkids. They were like, "Who are you?" You know, and literally they were like, "Who are you?" Right?
Right, because you weren't like that with them.
Yeah, you know. But Damon Wayans said, and I want to make sure I get this right. He said, "Grandkids teach us how we should have been and how we should have raised our kids."
Oh wow, that is so powerful.
Yeah,
I can totally see that.
yeah, and if you really think about it, right, that's what we do.
Yeah,
Um,
because we're older, wiser. If we would have known then what we know
what we
now,
know
kind of thing.
now,
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
right. And I go back to with that story, right? I think as parents, when you're trying to figure it out, you're trying to get from point A to point B, right? Because no one really like, prepared you for this. So you're trying to get from point A to point B. But with your grandkid, you can step back.
Yeah.
You can breathe. You can kind of let your guard down a little bit and be like, maybe if I do this, it's gonna feel different, and that's what I took from what he said. It really teaches us how we should have been and how we should have raised our kids.
Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about learning to set boundaries with your mom. You and I've had lots of conversations around that, and and also helping your daughter navigate some boundaries,
Mhm.
as she's grown up. So talk a little bit about, those boundaries, with the mom and then with, your daughter.
Sure. Yeah, I think there is a commandment that a lot of us have heard growing up, over the years, and that is honor your father and your mother,
Mhm.
Exodus 20:12.
Yeah.
Um, that one confused me for years. And I think it probably confuses a lot of people, especially if you're, born and raised in the church and you hear that. Um, I thought that honoring my mother meant that I had to put up with how she was treating me. Um, that, um, even when it was unhealthy, that I, I didn't have the gusto that your grandson has.
Mhm.
And to be, well, I don't know, maybe maybe I did talk back every now and then to her. Probably did.
But the outcome wasn't good,
Right, more than likely I talked
right?
back.
Yeah.
However, but just setting a boundary into place and as a child, I guess she didn't offer that opportunity to me like you offered that to your grandson. So it was a very frustrating relationship. I left home as soon as I could get out of there. I started my life, very young age. I grew up a lot faster than I needed to. So, I'm off living my life and I don't even live in Michigan anymore. I've been,
Mhm.
Texas, Hawaii, back to Texas. And over the years, she'd call me. She always initiated contact, everything. And I just finally said to her one day that, um, because it was always the same old stuff with her, and it was always the same old guilt trip and um, things of that nature, or just gossip and stuff that just I just didn't want a part of. So I asked her to give me some space that I didn't need to talk with her anymore. Having a conversation with her um, was not an easy thing to do.
Let me ask you, once you did that, right? A, how did that feel? And B, how long did it take? How long did you think about it before you actually said, "Hey, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna put it out there."
All right, so it wasn't until after 2002 or 3 that I said that to
Mhm.
her. And I remember that specifically because I was talking to a friend of mine, her mom. They kind of a friend of mine, her parents kind of adopted us, my ex-husband and I. We'd always go over there for holidays and everything, but I did share with my friend's mother that I told my mom that, and I remember she's a Catholic woman. She told me, "Oh, that's probably why you're having a hard time getting pregnant," because I was going through fertility issues. Because I told my mom that, is that she was telling me that God was punishing you,
Oh, wow.
basically. Yeah. So I remember the time frame because it was before I actually was able to get pregnant with Jacob. And so yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I was quite old. I was what,
Yeah.
late 20s.
And it took a while to actually do
Yeah,
that.
for me to actually finally do that. So
Okay.
I endured that for a long time.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, uh, as we talked about, we know that's, very difficult, a little bit scary, you
Mhm.
don't know how that other person's gonna react. But you also talked about the relationship with your daughter, right? And how you kind of gave her that safety to be able to set some boundaries as well. And I want to clarify stepdaughter, but as we know, she's your daughter.
Oh,
So um, that just kind of paints the picture,
sure.
sure. So
Yeah.
talk about that and what that was about.
Yeah. So, um, She was 3 when I met her dad. She was 4 when we got married. She came for summers to visit. She was there for the entire summer. And it wasn't until she was 7 that she actually came to live with us full time. Her mom, her biological mom, had was going through some stuff, and as soon as we recognized that, um, my ex-husband, he flew there immediately and he brought her back. And it was actually 2 weeks before I gave birth to my son. So all of a sudden, I've got a 7-year old and I've got a newborn. And she had just been there. This was in October, and she had just been there for this. Well, November, sorry. Um, and she had just been there for the summer, but I had seen a significant difference in her from the time that she had left us for the summer and just that fall. And I remember her crying sometimes, and just saying, "I don't understand. I don't understand what happened. Everything was just fine, before." Apparently, she just, come back to some significant chaos.
Right.
And I mean, at that point, I felt like I can relate to this little girl so much, and I started really feeling like, okay, I am her stepmom. I am her mom for a reason.
Right.
And then fast forward a few more years, her biological mom just kind of disappears, going through some things. And then all of a sudden, when she was a a tween, is that what they call them? Like 12, 13 years old, whatever. Um, her mom starts calling again. And, she's like, I went through a program and I, better how and whatever. So she'd call and she'd check on her and she'd talk to her. And, I never wanted to not want her to have a relationship with her biological mother. But uh, she would get upset after having calls with her. And I remember one time I went in her room and I talked to her after having a conversation with her mother. And she just was like, it's just so hard, it's like it's so difficult to talk to her. She just wants to act like everything is fine, that the stuff didn't happen. And I was like, I get it, I understand. And at that moment, again, I was like, all right. And I told her, I think I embraced her and I said, I now know why God put me in your life. And I sat her down and I just said, if having a relationship with her is too painful, you can tell her that. You can ask her to give you some space. And maybe then when you're older and you're a young woman, you can have that conversation with her that, about the things that you went through,
Right.
and how you felt.
Because you had literally done the same thing with your mom.
Right.
Yeah.
But I was able to tell her, help her recognize that a lot. I didn't have anybody tell me that. Like I said, I was late 20s, early 30s when I finally did that, and huge weight off my shoulders when I did that. Same with my daughter. I think it was huge weight off, and I didn't know she did it actually. The next time her mother had called, your mom's on the phone. She says, "Tell her I don't want to talk to her." I was like, "Oh, okay. I'm sorry. She says she doesn't want to talk to you." And she goes, "I figured that." And I was like, "Oh." She says, "Yeah." She said, "I got this letter from her."
Oh, wow.
I was like, "Did that?" I had no idea. Apparently, she gave the letter to her dad and asked her dad to send it. She didn't tell me anything about it. And her mom, said, "Yeah, she told me, that it was painful for her right now and that she had a mom she didn't need." And I said, "Well, I said, "I'm sorry." And her mom, I think, fully recovered, recognized everything,
Mhm.
she had done. And she just said, "Do you mind if I call you every now and then? And I ask you how she's doing if she's not willing to talk to me?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Absolutely. Yes, that's fine." So,
Yeah. That too is very deep, right? Because it's kind of that extreme, right? Where her setting that boundary was literally, setting that hard boundary that, hey, what I'm getting from you is not helpful to me and not what I need. So I need to just kind of back away from that. But the courage it takes to do that,
yeah.
right, has to be incredible. I would have never ever, going back to all the chaos in my childhood and growing up, um, felt like I would make it out alive if I said to my mom and dad, hey,
Yeah.
yeah, hey, I don't want to talk to you anymore because you got just until you get your stuff together, right?
Yeah.
So in those instances, we live with it, we deal with it, we just kind of like keep that stuff in. But it's extremely important, for healthy kids to learn, for kids to be healthy and learn how to set those healthy boundaries to be able to have that. And, in this case, right, luckily for me, right, I recognize I got it wrong, but then,
Mhm.
just, smart enough to know that, hey, I need to get this right. The last thing I want to say on this, right, as we're talking about kids, is I absolutely know that there's many times that I've not gotten it right with my own kids.
Mhm.
And as excited as I am about, growing and new things, it's almost that fear to just kind of, sit with them and say, hey, tell me when I didn't get it right. But, that's something that, at some point I would love to do, right?
Yeah.
Because I know there were times that I got it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, big time, and even at this later stage, I think it would be very healthy just to, for them to be able to, or for us to be able to have that conversation.
Yeah. I think that's awesome. I think you just gave them the invitation to do that, didn't you?
Yeah, I think maybe that could be a podcast episode, where we invite the kids on and they tell us where, we really screwed it up. So,
I mean, my kids are gonna say, "I didn't screw anything up."
oh my
Just teasing. No,
God.
I'm sure there's a lot of things, we walking wounded, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. We were just trying to get from point A to point B, and
yeah,
so
bleeding all over everybody in our
yeah,
lives. So,
yeah,
well, going back to boundaries, setting boundaries doesn't mean that you don't love somebody for it, right? It just means that you're protecting your heart,
right,
you know?
right. And you need to feel okay in doing that.
Absolutely.
So let's take a minute and talk about why boundaries are hard for people, especially with family members. So let's talk about why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because, you feel guilty, um, or you have a fear of conflict,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, or you just feel like you owe somebody something.
And you mentioned fear, right? That fear of, if I do this, right, what's going to be that repercussions?
You said it earlier.
Right? With a family member. Sometimes in relationships, right, there may be a behavior that feels familiar,
Right.
but we also have to recognize that just because something feels familiar, maybe that thing, that feeling, is not the right thing, and doesn't mean that it's healthy, as well.
Sure.
So, we've got to kind of make that distinction that, yeah, it may feel familiar, but it's not always healthy.
Yeah, and recognizing those patterns, um, that may start early in life, patterns of, you know, that type of thing, they can follow us into adulthood. So,
Yeah, and being able to feel like it's okay to say, hey, what's happening right now It's not something that feels comfortable for me. It's not something that I actually, feel like is helpful. And, I need some space, or, here's exactly what I need from you.
So, if somebody listening right now is thinking about boundaries in their own family, just remember number one, boundaries are not rejection. Number two, they protect relationships. Number three, kids deserve bodily autonomy and emotional respect. So, when someone crosses a boundary, just like Dwight said, you can say, I love you. However, I need to create some space right now.
And one of the things I think is really important out also is this, that as you're learning about setting boundaries and respecting boundaries, it's really okay to get it wrong, and to be able to recognize you got it wrong, but then, take those steps to kind of,
And learn from it.
and learn from what do I need to do to make it right. So that's an important part that, we don't want to miss.
For sure.
So one important point to take away from today: boundaries aren't walls. What they are guidelines that help you stay healthy in your relationships.
And whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or an adult child, learning to both set boundaries and respect them is one of the most important relationship skills we can develop.
Completely agree. So if this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who you think might benefit from it. Tell us about a time when you got it wrong, or a time when you got it right as it relates to boundaries. And we'll see you next time. Hey, as we wrap this up, we want you to remember something. Wisdom is not about getting everything right. It's about learning, choosing better, and having the courage to overcome the things that might be holding you back. This podcast, which is If I Knew Then What I Know Now, something that hopefully can help you do that. We're going to ask you to do this. Take what fits, leave the rest. Don't forget to smash that like button, hit that subscribe bell so we can bring you more content like this in the future. We'll talk again real soon.